Now for our roundtable with our political analyst, Mariana Mancuso and Brian Crowley. Two seismic events, coronavirus and the killing of George Floyd, redefining every political race from here to the White House. We begin our discussion there.
It's been striking, the dramatic changes that we've seen ever since the death of George Floyd. The protests in Florida have been important and significant. I think it's been amazing that the protests have included large numbers of white people who are finally recognizing that, what's been happening to African Americans in our state and our country has been wrong for many, many decades, and it's time for things to change. And I think we're seeing some progress in that direction. Is there resistance to that progress? Absolutely. Is it going to have a huge impact on the elections? I think absolutely. I think anybody running for office in Florida in November is going to have to address these issues in a kind way.
Mariana?
Yes, to Brian's point, we're going to have to see a lot more candidates that are running for office basically come out with plans for how they're going to handle racial profiling, how they're going to handle police brutality, if they're going to become very tough on police. And we're going to be watching for that as the election continues.
The mayor in our previous segment talked about the fact that many of these protests are very diverse. We're seeing the Black community together. We're seeing many in the white community coming together, the youth in our country helping drive many of the protests. The question will be, Mariana, millennials are often said they'll get out and protest, but will they get out and vote? That could be pivotal if they decide to vote with as much energy as they have in many cases decided to protest. What do you think happens?
The past couple of elections, millennials have really had an opportunity to actually sway the entire election. Unfortunately, we've seen that millennials really don't turn out on election day. I'm extremely hopeful, though, given the protests and the call for change in our society, that they will show up on election day and that they understand the importance of this election for our nation going forward.
The other seismic event that we continue to talk about, COVID, we're seeing an increase in cases in Florida. Here's in part what Governor DeSantis had to say last week.
As you're testing more, you're going to find more cases, and most of the cases are subclinical cases. And we expected that from the beginning. We're doing 30,000 plus tests a day in terms of results on average.
Mariana, it may be more testing. It may be there's a real rise in cases that have nothing to do with testing or nothing to do with the fact that we're just testing more. It's a big gamble every health department, every political leader is taking about reopening. Your take?
It is, and it's a very delicate balance. We're having all of these testings happening across the state. I think that's fantastic. I think we have to continue to look at the number of positive COVID cases. And also, I think that there becomes a level of ownership. People are starting to get out and things are reopening, and they're not necessarily adhering to social distancing standards or practices. And I think that at that point, it relies on the Floridian to take responsibility for their health and safety of others as well as themselves.
As Governor DeSantis has graded Brian, so shall perhaps be President Trump in Florida?
Oh, absolutely. I think President Trump and Ron DeSantis have been largely on the same page about all of these issues, and voters are going to be deciding in November whether or not voters in Florida in particular will be deciding whether or not the messaging and the conduct of Donald Trump and the things that he's done for COVID and for George Floyd and a host of other issues, whether or not that's been the right path. And DeSantis, who has tied himself at the hip with the president, is going to own it.
And speaking of, the president now will be giving his acceptance speech for the Republican nomination in Jacksonville. He'll be nominated by a pared down group of delegates gathering in Charlotte. He was mad at the Democratic governor there for not essentially guaranteeing he could have a full house for acceptance speech. So now he'll do that in late August in Jacksonville. Talk about that impact. It certainly sends the signal yet again of Florida's crucial importance here, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Florida is critical to the election. You don't win the presidency without winning Florida. And I think that Donald Trump's move is less to do with the fact that he's cranky with North Carolina, has more to do with the practicality of they have to win Florida. And as has been noted, they get the bonus of with Jacksonville being a media market that also goes into Georgia. So they get two bites of the apple with that. And it should be noted, they still have events that are taking place in North Carolina. But yeah, he'll be giving the big speech. And I thought it was ironic on Friday that Fox News was reporting that people who were going to Tulsa for his first big rally since the pandemic may be required to sign a form that says they won't sue the organizers and the party for if they get COVID-19. So isn't that ironic?
The Trump-Biden battleground here in Florida, Mariana, now President Trump won the state by a narrow margin in 2016. When you talk about COVID, when you talk about George Floyd and the movement that has come from that, how does it shift the political math? We tend to think of North Florida conservatives, Central Florida, a lot of independents, South Florida. The president in 2016 picked off more than enough votes in South Florida to help him, and then he picked up strongly in North Florida. Is the political math changing region by region here for the president vis-a-vis Joe Biden in Florida because of these issues?
Well, first, we have to talk about the president's approval rating. In a recent Gallup poll, he has dropped 10 points in the past 30 days, which is a lot for an approval rating. He's down to 39% of an approval rating. And then when we look at Joe Biden in terms of how both of him and Trump are polling nationally, Biden is leading with almost 50% of the vote across the country. And that is unique. And I know people, and Brian is going to say, oh, the polls, like we can't trust the polls after 2016. I don't take away from that. However, I do see that historically, if we look back at 2016, Hillary Clinton had a very difficult time cracking 50% in a majority of the polls heading into the general election.
Brian, how does Florida slice and dice politically? You've covered the state for so many years, and it's many diverse political groups rolled into one mega state. How does it change the dynamic for Joe Biden of where he concentrates in Florida and President Trump? Does it shift somewhat because of these major issues that are changing the entire political dialogue?
I don't know yet whether or not there's going to be any significant shift. I think that there's a certain lack of enthusiasm even among Democrats for Joe Biden. He's become sort of he's better than Donald Trump vote for a lot of people. That lack of enthusiasm could hurt him in November in Florida. But sure, the South Florida will remain absolutely critical to Democrats. The I-4 corridor will continue to be a swing area. It's going to be interesting to see, with all of the events that have taken place, with the real hurt that we have in the economy, whether or not the panhandle and some other traditionally Republican areas begin to shift a little bit because they become dissatisfied with the administration. I don't think we know that yet, but I think it's certainly possible that there may be a small shift, at least, which that would help Democrats.
Mariana, final thought on the shape of things to come in this state, so crucial to both men.
I think that watching Trump fight to have his re-election speech here in Jacksonville, Florida, is a sign that he is concerned about his support eroding in the Sunshine State.
Thank you both, and closing comments coming up in just a moment.